This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good evening. Good evening. Okay, let's try that again. I thought, walking from the side to the front, showing my presence, and my beautiful attire, would have got a stronger welcome. But I'll do it again, and then by the time I get to the podium, you'll be like, good evening. So I'll just start again. It's good to be able to bring a drama to the gathering. By the way, the reason why I was waiting here all that time, we were ready to go. I just wanted to create more drama in the space. Let's try. I'm not sure if my microphone is working, but I'll project my voice all the same. It is working, thank you. It's an honor to be here tonight. My name is Adisa. I'm a poet and a person who loves looking at African history. It's an honor to be here tonight as to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers, who I'll introduce very shortly. Welcome to the Len Garrison Memorial Lecture. This is the second in the series. Welcome to the Institute of Education, the Institute of Research. I mean, it's great that you've come. You could have gone straight home, glass of wine, EastEnders, all over. But you didn't do that. You've come to the lecture. So I'm really pleased that you're here today. We have a real feast in store for you with information and amazing knowledge to share with you. Before we get into proceedings, I'd like to introduce the Director of the Black Cultural Archives, Paul Reed, to say a few words to start the event officially.
Thank you, Lisa. I might cause some more trouble. Drawing upon tradition and culture, we may not start at all this evening. I must ask an elder, somebody older than myself, for permission to start. Now this is a difficult one, because as I look out, who do we look to? We're full of distinguished, wonderful, incredible contributions to our history and culture. I see so many. I look right in front of me and I see my elder, Eric Huntley, next to our distinguished guest, Emmanuel, and I ask, and we may go home, depending on what it is they say next. I ask for permission to start, sir.
It is my pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Give that a round of applause, because I think it's important that we start things correctly, inspiring us to proceed as we should do. On behalf of myself, the Director of the Black Cultural Archives, I'm here, of course, with the Chair of the Black Cultural Archives, Dawn Hill, and on behalf of ourselves and the Board of Trustees and all, it is our wonderful pleasure to have our Len Garrison Memorial Lecture with this incredible lineup of speakers as well. In terms of the BCA, I would imagine that there's one or two people in the room that's familiar with the organisation. We've done a lot, of course, since opening on the 24th of July 2014. But of course, the history of the organisation goes all the way back to 1981. And again, starting properly, those teachers, parents, historians, activists were, of course, standing on the shoulders of those that came before. I was speaking to a colleague, I'm trying to see if I can see you now, who was involved in the Black Culture Archives going way back when, and he reminded me that he was involved in a very early committee. Is he around? Of course, there's George Farrakhan Kelly. I'm wondering if there's anyone else that was involved in the Black Culture Archives going way back when. Of course, please, introduce your good self, my sister. Yes, you can. No, you can do that. Michaela Kuster, please, everybody. Come on. I think these things are important, that we remember where things have come from. Things don't just pop up out the blue, and certainly when it comes to organisations and institutions like this. at the BCA, we went through this incredible branding process, and we came up with the phrase, collecting, preserving and celebrating the history of black people in the UK. And of course that's important. But we interrogated that some more, and we said, because we need to change the narrative of our appreciation of British history and our appreciation of people of African descent in Britain. And unlike a technical approach to history which just provides us with details, one of the differences of the Black Cultural Archives is that we believe that this history is functional, especially when it comes to people of African descent, in as much as it makes a difference. I was speaking to a colleague the other day who said that he collects stamps, and I made the mistake of saying, it's not like stamp collecting. And of course, we had a long argument on the importance of stamp collecting. But you understand what I mean in terms of its importance. And in that functioning, we can think about some of the big social issues that we face and the role of history in terms of how we see ourselves and how it projects us forward, whether we see ourselves in the history books and so on and so forth, and the consequences of being omitted from history, major consequences when you're defined to particular moments in time, particularly if those moments are of deficit. So I went to our archive, because obviously we're the Black Culture Archives, and I found a document. And for those of us that are not familiar with our archive, please do contact us and interrogate the archive, because it's full of wonderful material. And I came across an interview that Len Garrison had with, it was called Black Success Stories by Zana. And it was a wonderful interview where Len was interviewed around about what it is that was motivating him, why was the Black Cultural Archives so important. And it's a lengthy document, so I won't go into it now, but it really does give us an indication as to why archives are so important, because we can go to those documents and we can get a sense of what was happening. Organizational records and so on are really, really important to tell us about the dramas and the struggles and the thoughts and the opinions of individuals and organizations. And I think that's really, really important. Within this document, I came across a section of a poem. And I see Len Garrison here today, and JC's just walked through the door. And Marie is somewhere. Where is Marie? Marie Wright. Please give Marie a round of applause, please. I'd like to invite Tunde. He's got this shocked look on his face, totally off the top of our heads, to join me. Can you come up here a second, please, Tunde? And I'd just like you to read out a section of this document. Could you do that? Thank you.
Where are our martyrs who died for freedom? Where are the warriors who tore open the pages of history to write their name in our blood? Where are our valiant heroes who fought to lift the burdening load from our backs? Where are the brave sons and daughters who sang with pride the songs of freedom and carved our names in the stony soil of those island mountainsides? They lay no known monuments for our children to stand upright with proud acclaim.
Thank you, Tunde. And so, where are all our monuments? You can get a sense. This is within the interview that Len had, where he was laying out some of his ideas and his concerns. And of course, there were many that were involved at the time. But within this document, he speaks about his concerns about racism. He speaks about his concerns about representation being seen within the history books, being able to find ourselves in the textbooks, He speaks about an emphasis of looking overseas for a sense of black history, overlooking the history of black people in Britain. For myself, because I have a background in youth and community work, Len also speaks about his work within a youth club in Brixton, on Railton Road, and his need to want to work with young people. A huge amount of work in Nottingham preceding. People may or may not be familiar, Len was also an accomplished writer in as much as he wrote, he was the author of Black Youth, Rastafarianism and the Identity Crisis in Britain. This was all about a search for identity, a major study, and of course he was highly influential in ASA in the 1970s and 80s, again concerned with multicultural education and being able to find materials for schools and teachers to be using. All of these issues, no doubt, continue today. A prolific writer. Part of his history, of course, where he was inspired by Queen Mother Moore, who visited in 1981, who gave Len and others and whispered in our ear that there is a need to memorialise our ancestors. And so there was a job that needed to be done in the UK. And Len, of course, with others, started up the African People's Historical Monument Foundation, and the Black Cultural Archives was born. We started to build an archive, and the record and the interview speaks about Len going up and down Portobello Road, into junk shops, antique shops, collecting from all over the place. He speaks about a collection of music that he found, which is about Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He refers to a concert in 1984 at the Commonwealth Institute. He was inspired by the Schomburg in America, and he just consistently speaks about the fact that in many cases you would almost suggest that we didn't exist, that we wasn't here. Now the wonderful thing that's happened, of course, is that work has continued, not just through the Black Cultural Archives, but the work of many organisations. Some people are present today. And the research continues, but there is a sense of needing to write this history. Of course, most of us may be familiar with staying power, but it feels very much that staying power is an excellent reference document. But it would feel to me that there's significant amounts of research that has happened since, and that there is a continuous need to write this history as the evidence base of that presence. And I think there's also a massive difference between the work of the historian and the work possibly of the activist, because based upon the historical record, we must then interpret and possibly join up the dots to make sense of what it is that we have here. And so, on that note, let me move on, because it takes us then into what work is taking place. And we have a few examples, distinguished, of course, examples, people who have done tremendous work, and there are many others. And I think with the Len Garrison Memorial Lecture, what I would urge us to possibly start to do is to collect this research and see if we can update Stay in Power. It will be more than one book on this occasion, of course. It will be volumes and volumes as we see ourselves in the history, and then get on to the wonderful work of sharing. Because, of course, we don't just want to write books and put them on shelves. We need to animate and be inspired and learn about, and it changes the way in which we think about things, think about ourselves, think about the relationships with ourselves, within our families, and with others. So on that note, I think that it's important for us to, once again, give our speakers the type of applause that infuses them and inspires them to do their very best this evening. We know that they are capable, but we want them inspired by our wonderful warmth that we create today. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.
Before I officially introduce our speakers and our first speaker, I thought it would be fitting if we would just turn to someone who you didn't come here with and just say, hello, Hi, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming. It's a little brief nod of appreciation to each other. We've created a nice space in here. Just for 2 They're telling me my voice is too soft, and I should man up. I like that. Mic up. 1, 2. Okay. Yeah, some people, you give me a mic that doesn't work.
1, 2.
Sounds better. Way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Patience. This is the babe and the suckling telling the elder patience. You gotta respect that. You gotta respect that. I see some people got a bit carried away there. I wanted to exchange phone numbers. That's not what we're doing. We're just saying hello. What brought you here today? Okay, our guests. On my far left, please put your hands together for Dr. Miranda Kaufman, please. Sitting in the middle, like a red rose and a blue dress. And we had a wonderful conversation before we started today. Is Marika Sherwood, please. Put your hands up, Marika. And on my immediate left, we have a brother called David Olusoga. Please give it for David, please. Thank you. And David starts the proceedings. A little bit about David. David, as you can see, is a handsome young man. That's not why he's here, though. David is a British Nigerian historian, a broadcaster and filmmaker, born in Lagos, Nigeria. David studied history and journalism before joining the BBC. He's an award-winning documentary maker. Most recently, the BBC documentary series entitled Forgotten Slave Owners. Anybody see that?
Oh, yes.
Yes. And is also co-author of the Kaiser's Holocaust, Germany's Forgotten Genocide and the Colonial Roots of Nazism. Author of The World's War and a contributor to the Oxford Companion to Black British History. Please put your hands together for a warm welcome for David Olusoga. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Is that mic working? How about now?
Projecting very well.
Nothing on TV videos or anything, no? Having a red light. Is that working now? Yes. It's just a delay while they switch channels. That's great. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak tonight, and it feels appropriate to be discussing the Great War, World War I, World War II, whatever, World War I, First World War, whatever we want to call it, a few days after Remembrance Day. There are photographs in the Imperial War Museum of events taking place in August and September 1914, not far from here. In Holborn and Old Scotland Yard, which is near Downing Street, men queued round the block to join the British Army. The recruiting officers spent days processing the applications. That period, before the real nature, the brutality of the First World War was obvious, was characterised by what journalists at the time called war fever. That same sentiment, in the same weeks, was infused in crowds thousands of miles away. That same idea that the war was some great adventure, a chance to show loyalty to king and country and belief in the project of empire, was not limited to Britain. It was strong in the Caribbean, it was strong in India, But in Jamaica, it was a powerful moment. Men sold their belongings and paid for passage to get to Britain, to join up. There were unprompted, unscripted speeches and rallies on the street, impromptu. There were expressions of loyalty to empire by many people who, in 1914, believed earnestly that they were regarded and respected as citizens of that empire. Fewer people believed that in 1918. The patriotism and war fever of 1914 was fused also by the suffocating poverty of the Caribbean islands. On islands like Jamaica in the early years of the 20th century, there were so few opportunities for employment that the war was seen as a chance not just to demonstrate loyalty, but to become adults, to become a man, to become a breadwinner and a provider. The First World War represented an outlet, potentially, or so it was thought, for the skills and the energies of dynamic people who had been denied work at home for decades. None of these expressions of loyalty or patriotism enthused the War Office. The officials who were running the war looked upon the prospect of thousands of black men arriving from the Caribbean to join the volunteer ranks of the army with antipathy. In late 14, the War Office set out to prevent men from the Caribbean from enlisting and threatened to repatriate any who arrived on Britain's shores. In May 1915, 9 men from Barbados landed on the SS Danube. They were found in the London docks, and they were taken not to a recruiting office, but to the West Ham police courts, where they were fined, mocked by the judge, and deported. Other West Indian soldiers, or would-be soldiers, did make it as far as the recruiting officers. A handful, we believe, were accepted. Recruiting officers were based on individual sergeants, some of whom found it in their heart to allow these men to join the British Army, but many were left destitute, unwanted, in a country about which they discovered they knew little, with no friends and few prospects. There were deep concerns within the Colonial Office of the behaviour of the War Office in 1914 and 1915. The idea that the news, that the earnest offers of service were being rejected, the fear that that news would reach the Caribbean, and the fear that the evidence of what was happening was entirely racial, disturbed the officials of the Colonial Office. The man who intervened was actually George V himself. It was the king who pushed through the establishment of a West Indies regiment, a new infantry formation in the British Army. I'm not going to proceed to tell people the history of the British West Indies regiment, but I do want to tell you about a figure who's becoming an important diarist in the First War. His diary was only really discovered a few years ago. His name was Pastor Vallingham, and he lived in Dickabus, which is an absolutely tiny little hamlet in Flanders. And he is one of the most important war diarists that we know of. He was a man who literally, because of where he lived, saw the war pass in front of his windows. He watched the war from his own house, from his own community, and because he was an immensely nosy man, he met many, many people from his community and those who came through his communities. And in May 1917, he wrote in his diary, a number of Negroes have come to work on Adam's farm in, terrible, I think I can speak Flemish, pronounce it till I go there, but I got it completely wrong, but I'm told it's Digoenen, the town of Digoenen. He wrote, these men are from Jamaica and the West Indies. They are dressed like English soldiers, and they are polite and speak softly. Despite their politeness, Vallingham explained that the local people didn't like the Jamaicans. They're not very popular among us because of their long fingers. In general, the local people prefer to see the back rather than the front, because if they drop in somewhere for a cup of coffee, it's just as likely that they will stay a few hours as a few minutes. That's classic Belgian hospitality. However, Pastor Vallingham, a few days later in his diary, seems to have completely changed his mind about the Jamaicans. Despite their long fingers, he discovered that many of them were Catholic, and that enormously shifted his opinions. Then one day he read a letter by the mothers, written by one of the mothers of the soldiers. such fine, upright, crystalline, motherly feelings for me. None of our mothers could write any better. Bradlingham was always alert to little cultural differences of the many encountered. And he was interested to note that the Jamaicans, men from an island that produced tobacco, smoked cigars rather than, as he said, most soldiers prefer cigarettes. Men like Pastor Bradlingham, a pastor in a small Belgian town, was never supposed to meet men from the Caribbean. He was never supposed to meet any of the men that he met, men from other West Indian islands, men from Canada, men from America, both African Americans and white Americans, Australians, both white Australians and Aboriginals, and Chinese labourers. He wasn't supposed to meet the South African Native Labour Corps who passed through his town. He wasn't supposed to meet the thousands of West Indian, Tirailleurs, Senegalese, men from across French West Africa. He wasn't supposed to meet any of those people. Is that not how empires work? These were unprecedented encounters that were made possible by the war. They weren't the plan. Empires thrive on separation and not on encounter. But in 1917, the Western Front was the most diverse place they had ever been in the history of the world. Often when we've written and examined the history of the First World War, we've done so from a black history perspective to try to write back into the record the service of black soldiers from Africa and the Caribbean who fought and died in the war. And we've seen important work that is brought back into our consciousness, men like Walter Tull. But I think when it comes to the First World War, it's just as important to think about what the war meant, not just to black people who found themselves in it, but to the men who dominated the world, the men who ran the empires of the world. By 1914, every Caribbean island, apart from Haiti, was a colony of a European power, and every state, every polity in Africa, apart from Ethiopia and Liberia, were likewise colonial possessions of Europe. At the same time, the involvement of black people in a great conflict was a challenge because this was not just the high watermark of empire, it was the high watermark, or reaching the high watermark of the race theory. It took place around the time that the social Darwinian sciences were becoming highly sophisticated. The pseudo-scientific subversion of eugenics was beginning to find its voice. In 1908, the Eugenics Society that had been formed in America, Cold Spring Harbor, was up and running, trying to work out the racial backgrounds of the complicated mixed peoples it found in Virginia and elsewhere in America. Yet the conflict forced colonialists and the theorists of race to have to abandon temporarily, or at least lower temporarily, the barriers of race. And they had to break some of the rules of empire. Most profoundly, they had to arm black African soldiers and to allow them, not just allow them, to order them to fight in a war in Europe. Now, everywhere in empires, one of the rules in which empires were run was that black and brown men were not given weapons. Britain had spent, as had France and Belgium and the other imperial powers, had spent much of the late 19th century trying to get guns out of the hands of black Africans, and now it was putting them into their hands. The deployment of black soldiers to the battlefields of Europe was loaded, therefore, with problems. It was a phenomenon that challenged those central tenets of empire, but it was also a deployment that challenged the racial hierarchies that underpinned those empires. If black and brown men were ordered to fight and kill white men, they would see that white supremacy was a myth. That white men were as fearful in a shell hole or under fire as they were. The mystique, the racial mystique, was one of the forces that allowed the conjuring trick of empire to take hold of so many people, would be shown wanting. But World War I exposed huge differences between the Allied nations in their attitudes towards non-white peoples. And it was peoples of African descent that were the focus of the biggest disagreements and discrepancies. What you get between 1914 and 1919, the war really, when it comes to black people who were involved in the armies of occupation, the war does rumble on until 1919. What you get is a jumble of illogic. Different races are treated differently at different times in different theatres of war by different colonial powers. At the centre of this confusion was the concept of a hierarchy of races, both consciously and subconsciously. The European colonial project had put black people at the bottom. Only Aboriginal peoples in the Antipodes were seen as so low. But black people were also regarded as being especially martial, of having the military skills, the military propensity innately that would make them valuable soldiers. Different countries behave differently at different times towards not just the status of black soldiers, but their rights and even their humanity. Here's some examples of that racial ideological chaos. The French put Algerian and Moroccan and West African troops into the front line from 1940 onwards. The British recruited thousands of Africans but never allowed them to fight in Europe. Black British troops from the Western Front were sent to the West, from the Caribbean, were sent to the Western Front, but they were only supposed, at least, to labour behind the lines. In the end, there was engagement involving West Indian soldiers, but they were never planned. They were accidental, caused by the vagaries of war. While the West Indians were being made to labour, and they did understand it as a racial slur, and it was intended as a racial slur, and it was not the first or the last. There were men from Britain's small black community, men like Walter Tull, who I mentioned earlier, who were able to fight, who slipped through the colour bar of the armies of regulations. Behind the lines, white South Africans were preparing to fight in the front lines, while black South Africans were reduced again to the status of labourers. No army, no division, no unit was so badly dishonoured, insulted and dehumanised in the war as the South African Native Labour Corps. Everything was done to ensure that they had no contact with white Europeans, and their service in the war was rendered deliberately as unglamorous as possible. Their uniforms were made from accordion. Their hats were designed to be floppy and not have any resemblance to military hats. They had no badges, no brass buttons. Enormous sophistication was put into the removal of any military glamour from their war experience and into the segregation of them from other armies and from, most importantly, French and Belgian civilians. This system was so sophisticated that lessons learnt on the Western Front were then fed into the development of the apartheid system, which was to come later in the century. The Americans were no more sure than the Europeans. Most black Americans in the First World War served as labourers, but the US did allow, under huge pressure and despite the ambitions of the High Command, to allow 7 black regiments to enter into combat and to serve and fight as combat regiments. But 4 of them were placed under the command of the French army rather than the white American army. America refused, for the most part, and most generals refused outright, and in paper and publicly, to lead mixed-race armies. Therefore, the majority of black American soldiers in the First World War fought in the French army, wearing French helmets, carrying Martin French rifles. They were so successful, they were so popular, they were so militarily distinguished that the US Army had to issue, or decided to issue, a secret order that asked that French officers treat black soldiers as, quote, an inferior being. The document warned that American white sensibilities would be offended if African American soldiers were treated with any respect. The French quietly refused to follow the American instructions, partly because they didn't want to offend their own African soldiers. The enemy was less confused. From 1914 onwards, from October, right until the end of the war and into the occupation of the Rhinelands between 1919 and 1923, Germany repeatedly and energetically denounced the presence of black soldiers on the Western Front as a racial betrayal, that it was a crime against the white race. Despite being at war with Germany, there were many in America who, after 1917, who agreed with this. After the war, the 2 of the most influential racial theory books of the 20th century, The Rising Tide of Colour by Lothrop Stoddard and The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant, the latter book being one of Hitler's favourites, both considered that the inclusion of non-white soldiers in the Allied armies on the Western Front had been a disaster, an act of racial betrayal that threatened the white race's prestige and the future of the European empires. Those books both sell hundreds of thousands of copies. I'd like to finish in the few minutes I've got left by asking one of the big questions that comes out of the treatment and the status accorded to African and Caribbean soldiers in the First World War. And it's this: why was it that Britain didn't deploy men from Africa and the Caribbean in combat roles on the Western Front? Now, France did. From 1914, from October 1914 right through to the end of the war, France relied on its African soldiers. At one point, 9 to 11% of the French army in combat were black Africans. Now, Britain had a bigger empire in Africa, not by surface area, but by population. Britain also had its colonies in the Caribbean. And it never sent black soldiers to fight in France and Britain. When you think about that, that's an incredible decision. It's incredible in 1914 and 1915. It is astonishing in 1916, as we'll all be remembering next summer after the Somme, that the volunteer army that had been recruited, the men who had queued around the blocks not far from here in the winter of 1914, were decimated. There was a profound feeling, the documents show us, that there was every chance Britain would lose the war after the Somme. Absolute crisis of manpower that led to panic in Whitehall in the months and weeks after the Somme, led to enormous soul searching. How was Britain going to find another volunteer army? How was a country that had no tradition of large standing armies, or at least domestic large standing armies, going to find yet another standing army? Now, there were those in London who wanted to adopt the French model, who thought the answer to that dilemma was Africa. In August 1914, beginning of the war, with Britain still then only struggling to hold a very minor place in the war, the MP, R.P. Houston, became one of the first to challenge the official reluctance to raise an African army. He called for a recruitment, for the mass recruitment of what he called the martial races of Africa. He was most keen on the Zulu of South Africa and also the Hausa of Nigeria. He called for their rapid deployment on the battlefields of Europe. The issue came back predictably in those months and weeks after the Somme. With the military leadership plunged into crisis, there was some consideration of changing policy and recruiting black men to fight. Yet the government steadfastly refused. The opposition to the government formed what's called the Black Army Lobby. The most vociferous spokesman was Major Darnley Stewart Stevens, a career soldier who commanded the Lagos battalions in Nigeria in the 1880s. In October 1916, just after the Somme, he wrote a review called Our Million Black Army. Stevens promised that his personal intervention could create a force of 20,000 Africans in just 2 months. He described Africa as an unlimited reservoir of manpower, and he projected full-scale recruitment drive in Africa would produce a force 500,000 strong that could then be thrown into the war. The man who came to support him most vocally was Winston Churchill. In 1916, he argued in the House of Commons that Africans must be recruited and deployed. He wrote, "Let us think what future historians would write if they were writing a history of the present time and had to record that Great Britain was forced to make an inconclusive peace because she forgot Africa. At a time when every man counts, the government of Great Britain is unable to make any use of that mighty continent. It would be an incredible thing, but it is taking place. While we are sitting here, going to dinner or going home to bed, nearly 1,000 men, our men, Britishers, Englishmen, men of our own race, are being knocked into bundles of bloody rags every 24 hours. Every measure must be considered and none put aside." What Churchill was proposing was to do what the French were doing. All of the French documents from 1917, 1918, from Clemenceau down to battalion commanders, show that the French were beginning to see the deployment of Africans as a way of saving white lives. And the racial hierarchies that underpinned empire had manifested themselves on the Western Front. I could go on about the evidence of how racial hierarchies determined who lived and who died on the Western Front, how European anthropological views of your tribe could decide whether you were in a combat role or behind the lines role. But I think it's important to finish on the question, why is none of this known? Why has this been forgotten? There's been more books written about a couple of dozen white middle-class poets than there have about 4 million non-white, non-European men who fought and laboured on the Western Front and in all the battlefields of the First World War. We've allowed the war to become this tiny European feud when it was, by its nature, and the clues in the name, a world war. Thank you.